Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I have something really cool. It is the Super Nintendo Dejitter board. This one comes from Arthremis, but they're all based off of Marx's Dejitter board idea. The other thing I have is the Super Nintendo Capacitor Kit from Console 5. So we're gonna go ahead and install these bad boys. I'll show you how to do it and tell you why you wanna do both these mods. Well, first, why would you wanna do the SNES Dejitter mod? The Super Nintendo has this issue with its output where the first few lines are actually out of sync from the rest of it. This wasn't a problem for CRT TVs because those first few lines are actually hidden by the overscan of a CRT, so you're never gonna see the top of it through a CRT. The problem comes into play when you have a modern TV that expects a more perfect signal. When you use a Super Nintendo through an OSSC, that imperfect signal from the Super Nintendo might throw off the TV. Also, some capture cards don't like the output from an OSSC without a Dejitter board, so you might not be able to capture footage from an RGB modded Super Nintendo without the Dejitter mod. Why would you want to use one of these cap kits to recap a system? Over time, all non-solid electrolytic capacitors are going to leak. When those capacitors leak, the fluid from the capacitor can actually eat away at the PCB and ruin it. So you have a chance of ruining your console if you don't replace the capacitors. This console is from the 90s. It's definitely due for a cap replacement. I got an overhead camera rig, so I'm gonna show you guys how to install these things. Let's hop over to the bench and I'll show you the tools that you're gonna need. Hey guys, welcome to the bench. Everything that you see here is all the tools that you're gonna need for both the Dejitter mod or the cap replacement. Now, this is what I considered hard mode, okay? These are the bare minimum tools that you're gonna need to get this job done. You'll see in a minute some more recommended tools, but we'll go through these one by one. First things first, you're gonna need a soldering iron. I have the Hakko FX888D. This is kind of old school now. I don't think a lot of people recommend the Hakko anymore. There are newer and cheaper soldering irons that will do just as good, if not a better job than the 888D, but this is what I'm working with. Then, along with the soldering iron, you're gonna need some solder. I use Kester. This is 0.5 millimeter solder. You really want thin solder. It's very helpful for these kind of retro mods. Then you're gonna need some flux. I really like this No Clean Flux pen. It has a little, almost looks like a marker, and when you push down the tip here, it will dispense some solder out on the PCB. You're also gonna need some solder wick. I actually prefer this over using one of those solder sucker. These things are absolute garbage, especially when you buy the cheapo ones. You can use solder wick to take the capacitors off of the board. The last things you're gonna see here are wire cutters and wire strippers. These are gonna be used for cutting the wires for the Dejitter mod, as well as stripping the wires. These cutters go down to 30 AWG. You really want wire strippers that are for small gauge wire. All right, next we're gonna talk about some optional things that you might need. Tweezers are always really helpful. You can hold down the wire while you're trying to solder them with the other hand. They just make some parts of the install easier. A ribbon cable stripper. Inside of here, there are teeth that can strip a whole ribbon cable at the same time. That's really helpful. Next we have flux paste. This is good for putting flux on a bunch of ribbon cable connectors at a time when you're trying to tin them. Also, it can protect the jacket from the ribbon from getting melted. That's a Voltar tip. Next we have extra ribbon cable. This is useful for all sorts of retro mods. The wires are pretty small, which is nice and compact, and it looks pretty. Over here we have isopropyl alcohol and a gross old toothbrush for cleaning flux or capacitor leak fluid from a PCB, just to make it nice and clean again. You want as high a percentage ISO as you can get. Last but not least, we have a desoldering gun. This is an alternative to using the solder sucker or solder wick to remove solder and desolder components. I actually just purchased this. I'm really excited to give this guy a try. All right, now that we've gone over the tools, let's work on this cap replacement. First thing we gotta do is we gotta open up the Super Nintendo. Gotta flip it over. Forgot to mention that you're gonna need a game bit adapter for this. I just have an iFixit kit, and the iFixit kit comes with a bunch of bits, and one of those bits is the game bit. We'll go ahead and unscrew this. And that one too. Guys. Okay. Lift this up, put that aside. Next, we're gonna switch to Phillips and unscrew all the rest of these screws. So there's 2 silver ones here, and 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 up here. Silver ones first. Okay, then you can just lift the board out, put the bottom shell aside, take this little shield off. Okay, so it looks like the capacitors in this this console are here underneath this RF shield. So we're gonna have to take this big RF shield off as well. I think that's just 1 screw here on this, I think this is a voltage regulator, and these 2 screws here. The screw for that voltage regulator has a washer on it, and there's a shield off. Now that we've got this open, let's open these caps and see what we're working with. In the package from console 5, you get actually more capacitors, I think, than you need. So these 8 here correspond on my console to the 8 capacitors straight across here. That's all I'm gonna do right now. I'll have to look up what these other 2 over here go to, and I'll let you know. If you've never done a cap replacement before, you wanna make sure that that number there, so like, looks like this one is 470 microfarads. You just wanna make sure that the capacitors that you are replacing here match the ones that were on your board in the right order. So that's very, very important. All right, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna show you the hard mode way to remove one of these consoles. And I say it's hard, it's not really that hard, but there are better ways to do it that won't risk nuking the board here and the pads. That was basically the reason I bought the desolder gun, and you'll see that afterwards. But let's go ahead and we'll try to remove these capacitors using solder braid. Got my Hakko fired up. Mine is going to be set to 700 degrees Fahrenheit. While that's heating up, I'm going to add flux to underneath the capacitor that we're going to remove. We're going to start with this far right one, which on the top is 220 microfarads. Add some flux right to this PCB. Whoa, that was a lot. No biggie. I like to actually add fresh solder to these, so go ahead and add some more to the solder joints. Then you're gonna take your solder wick. Start with this bottom one here. I like to just kind of lay it next to the capacitor pad. Go ahead and just put some heat on it. Let the solder soak in. You can actually see it going up the solder braid there. These vias are kind of small, so basically the goal is to try to wick away as much solder from inside of this via as possible with the braid. So you're trying to do all the work with the solder wick. If you have to, you can add more solder back into here. Basically what that's doing is you're combining fresh solder with the old solder. Hopefully we'll be able to remove the solder all in one good go. Once you go back in here with the solder wick, you're actually gonna move on to the next section of bare copper. You don't want to reuse that old spot. If you've done this right, is to try to get this leg of the capacitor to be able to wiggle by itself without too much effort. That means that the leg of the capacitor is free from solder all the way around. Go ahead and do the same thing for the other side. Now another little hack is once you think you've got one of these legs done, you can actually grab onto the capacitor on the other side, just very gently. You don't want to rip it out. This bottom leg is already free. This top leg, apply some heat to it. You can give it a little wiggle. Just be very careful here. You don't want to put a ton of heat on these pads. You don't want to rip them out. And you want to go very slowly when you are pulling the capacitor out. And there you go, that's one done. Before you move on, you want to remove the solder from these holes too, completely remove them using the solder braid. There you go, you got 2 nice clean holes now. Now before moving on, let's hit this with some isopropyl alcohol, and then we'll talk about the better way to handle these. All right, now, before we move on, let's replace this capacitor, and we'll do that for each one. That way we can confirm that we're putting the right capacitor back in its place. Okay, the old one was a 220 microfarad capacitor, so the new one is going to also be 220 microfarad. When installing the new capacitors, you want to make sure that you find on the board which side is positive and which side is negative. Capacitors are actually polarized, so this side is negative and the opposite side is positive. The other thing you can do is look at the length of the legs. So the long legs are positive and the short legs are negative. Go ahead and look at the board and see if you can find this bottom side here is negative. We're gonna put the new capacitor in there, negative on the bottom. A good way to keep them in place is to spread these legs apart before you solder, so go ahead and do that. Now just go ahead and tack one side of this down. You want just a nice silver mound of solder. That's how you know you've got enough. Just kind of make sure that your capacitors are lined up a little bit, and then you can go ahead and tack the other side. Then you can cut these legs. I like to cut them a little bit above the solder joint. That takes care of this first one here. We've got a bunch more to do. I really don't like doing the heat up and wiggle technique. I really think that that's dangerous to some boards. You have a high chance of messing up these pads here. You can try to use the solder sucker. I just think that those are kind of garbage. And when I do this kind of work, I don't want to make those kind of mistakes and ruin whole boards. So I went ahead and ordered myself a desoldering gun. Here's a desoldering gun. It's pretty much the same as a regular soldering gun. This tip gets hot, but it has a vacuum inside that can pull the solder out of those via holes. I accidentally didn't hit record and didn't catch me doing the first cap. Let me tell you, this is a lot easier than the heat and wiggle method. I'll show you the first cap with this, but then I'm just gonna skip to the next part so you don't have to watch me replace all the caps. Ugh, gross. All right, that's it for the caps. I fired this up off screen and it's working good. Now we're gonna clean up the table and get ready for the Dejitter mod. I found out what these other caps are for. This 1000 microfarad is actually for a Super Famicom, so I don't think it's applicable to the Super Nintendo in North America. And this other 470 microfarad capacitor is supposed to go across the voltage regulator. It's supposed to help with aftermarket power supplies or aging power supplies for the Super Nintendo, so I might revisit that in the future. Before doing any mods, you need to look up the tutorial on how to do them, and fortunately, Arthremis has his own tutorial about how to do this, so I'm gonna follow along with his tutorial, but I'm gonna show you how to do it on mine. So let's take the parts out of the bag. He gives you the Dejitter mod, and he gives you this nice ribbon cable. I'm not sure if we're going to use this or not. Okay, so he starts out by removing the CSYNC wire from the RGB mod, but I'm gonna go ahead and stick down the Dejitter board on the board here just to get it out of the way. He uses this spot here. He pulls power for the mod from the C5 resistor here. So there's this little section here on the board directly below the RGB wires that fits this board perfectly. And boom, just like that. The next thing we're gonna do is remove the original CSYNC. So from the CSYNC pad here on the board to the Voltar's RGB mod, we're gonna remove that completely because we're going to get CSYNC from the Dejitter board. This is a good job for the tweezers. Gonna hold on to the wires here. Go ahead and heat up the old wire, take it right off. Now you can try to just pull this wire off, but if you have a hard time, you can use an X-Acto knife. Maybe kind of hold these other wires down with your hands so you don't pull the solder joints. Yeah, that's kind of fun. And when you get to the other end, just be careful too. Hold down on these other wires gently. Okay, then we're just gonna heat up this wire. That's it. Okay, now that C-Sync is removed, there's two pieces that we're gonna remove from the original board here. The first piece is the crystal here. I'm gonna use the fancy desoldering gun. Hey, that was easy. Next, C3 right there. He adds fresh solder to both sides. Let's go ahead and do that. Should be able to just get some fresh solder on our tip here and then wiggle back and forth between the two ends of this capacitor. There we go. Okay, now let's go ahead and tin the dejitter board. So we're gonna tin the 5-volt and ground up here, CSYNC in, CSYNC out, as well as clock here. Okay, next we're going to connect 5-volt and ground from C5 here. Arthremis says that the left side of this C5 capacitor is 5 volts and the right side is ground. So we're gonna connect a wire from C5 to 5-volt and ground on the board. Okay, I've got this black and white wire from my extra ribbon cable, but you can use the gray wire that comes in the kit. First, go ahead and clip these cables in half. So grab your clippers and clip them. Right, now these are stripped. I'm gonna go ahead and use this guy. You can stick the ribbon in there so we got some flux on both sides. Don't worry about cleaning these up yet, just get some solder on them, tin them up. Okay, that looks all right. You can cut these a little shorter so that they're both the same length. Go ahead and tin both sides of C5. Be careful not to remove it. Okay. Right is ground, so go ahead and solder that one. Turn it around, we'll do 5-volt to the left side. Next, we're gonna measure the leftover wire here. Give ourselves a little bit of slack, cut it. Go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Give them a dip in the flux. Boop. Tin. Black to ground, white to 5-volt. Pretty good. Okay, next is to bridge this little jumper, JP3, on the dejitter board. Okay, so next is attaching CSYNC to the CSYNC in on the dejitter board. I kind of messed up. I should have left the CSYNC wire from the original RGB mod in place on this end and just reattached it on this other end over here. So that's my bad. I'm gonna try to get this wire back in the hole here and then attach the other end over here. Okay, I think we got it. And this other end is almost perfect. All right, there we go. CSYNC from the board to CSYNC in on the dejitter. Next is to attach CSYNC out on the dejitter to the CSYNC pad on the RGB board. Make sure when you're cutting this that it's long enough to reach from here to up here. Go ahead and strip this end, tin it, trim it to length, solder it back up here. Go ahead and measure down here and attach it here. Now, I don't know if this matters. I don't like how these wires sort of go across each other, especially the 5-volt. So I'm gonna take some slack out of this wire here. I'm gonna pull it tighter and cut this end a little bit shorter so that we have less slack. It's just a couple of millimeters, but I think it'll make it a little nicer. Not perfect, but now at least this wire is not going to go across these voltage wires. Last but not least is this right clock hole here. We're gonna solder a wire into there, and then it's going to go to the clock pad here on the dejitter board. Get our wire here, the wire through the via, tack that in with just a little bit of solder so it doesn't move. Good, and then we're gonna go and add a tiny bit more. And finally, we're going to measure this wire here and cut it to length, tin it, and connect it to the clock pad here. There we go. That is everything for the Dejitter mod. Let's go ahead and connect this up to the OSSC and see if we get video through my monitor. Okay, very quickly, we're going to turn on the Super Nintendo here with the Dejitter mod installed before it's put back together. The heatsink is not on that voltage regulator, so I just want to do this quickly just to see if we get any signal from the capture card. Turn on the OSSC, go ahead and turn on the Super Nintendo, and through the Elgato, we got some signal, so that's great. Putting it back together is pretty much the same thing as taking it apart. Just remember that the heatsink for the voltage regulator gets the screw that has the
little washer in there.
I connected the Super Nintendo to my TV downstairs and it actually ended up working. I noticed something interesting now. I'm using FireBrandX's OSSC profiles. After the Dejitter mod, it messes with those FireBrandX profiles. So I'll have to look into tweaking those to make the colors come together. They kind of were stretched out a little bit. For the most part, I think I'm happy. I'm just gonna have to tweak that FireBrandX profile for my system. Let me try to sum up my thoughts. Would I recommend the Dejitter mod? I think I would. The Dejitter mod was simple to do. The only thing that you have to remove is that crystal. It may not be necessary depending on whether or not your TV or your capture card gets desynced by your Super Nintendo. Would I recommend the cap replacement? Yes, but it's not easy. It's not a beginner-friendly mod. Anytime you have to remove things from a PCB, there's always a chance that you could ruin the console. So do some practice on something else, some old piece of electronics or an old computer part that you have just lying around that you don't want anymore. Do some desoldering practice before you jump into this kind of recap mod. Do I recommend the Hakko FR301? Absolutely. This thing is a huge lifesaver. It's going to be saving a lot of boards from getting destroyed. It's a little pricey. It's very pricey, but if you're going to be doing a lot of mods yourself or working on a sentimental console that is yours from when you were a kid, you really can't risk buying a second console. Buy a desoldering gun. It's going to save you a ton of time, headache. As you can see from the footage, those capacitors just pop right off the board with no problem. Absolutely worth the money. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below, or if you want me to review the desoldering gun more, please like this video and subscribe. It really helps me out. I'll see you in the next video.